There are moments in history when a single decision made behind closed palace doors sends shockwaves through an entire nation and across the world. This is one of those moments. A king, a disgraced brother, a throne that must be protected at all costs, and a choice so dramatic, so final that it hadn't been made in over 100 years. What happened inside the British royal family was not just news. It was the end of something and the beginning of something entirely different. This is that story. On the morning of October 30, 2025, something happened inside the walls of Buckingham Palace that nobody could have imagined just a year before. A short but devastating statement was released to the public. It came from the palace itself. It was measured, formal, and carefully worded, the kind of language that powerful institutions use when they want to say something enormous without appearing to shout. But what it said was louder than anything a shout could carry. King Charles III, the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom, had decided to strip his own brother of every royal title he had ever held. Every single one. The man who had been Prince Andrew, Duke of York, a title he had carried since birth, would no longer hold that name. He would no longer be a prince. He would no longer hold any of the honors that the British crown had bestowed upon him across 6 decades of life. He would simply be known from that day forward as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a private man, a man without a crown. A man without a palace roof over his head. The world stopped for a moment. People read the headlines and read them again. Some thought there was a mistake. Some thought it must be exaggerated. It wasn't. What the king had done was historic in the most literal sense of that word. The last time a prince of the British royal family had his title formally removed was more than 100 years ago, during the First World War, when a member of the royal line who had fought for Germany was stripped of his honors by an act of parliament. That was 1917. More than a century had passed. An entire world had come and gone. 2 world wars, the fall of empires, the birth of nations. And yet nothing like this had happened again until now. Until King Charles, fighting his own battle with cancer, looked at everything happening around his brother and made a decision that would define his reign. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you have to go back a little. You have to understand who Prince Andrew was, not just in terms of titles and rank, but in terms of what he represented within the royal family and what he had become. Andrew Albert Christian Edward was born on February 19, 1960, the 3rd child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. He grew up inside a world that most human beings can barely imagine, a life of palaces and protocol, of royal duties and public appearances, of an existence that is both extraordinarily privileged and extraordinarily constrained. He served in the Falklands War as a helicopter pilot in 1982, which for many years gave him a reputation for genuine bravery that the rest of his life would slowly and painfully erode. He was married to Sarah Ferguson in 1986, and though that marriage ended in divorce in 1996, the two remained close, a fact that would continue to define his life in strange and complicated ways. For many years, Andrew's public role was relatively uncomplicated. He was the 3rd child of the Queen, behind Charles and Anne, and well ahead of Edward. He attended state occasions. He represented the crown on trips abroad. He smiled at cameras and shook the right hands. He was, in the way of many minor royals, a visible but largely unremarkable presence in the life of the nation. But beneath the surface, another story was being written. And that story had a name that would eventually become inseparable from Andrew's own, Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was an American financier, a man of enormous wealth and influence, and a convicted sex offender whose crimes against underage girls were some of the most disturbing to emerge from the world of the powerful and the connected in recent memory. He was arrested in 2019 on federal charges of sex trafficking and died in his prison cell, officially ruled a suicide, though the circumstances have never fully left the realm of public suspicion. What his death did not do, however, was make the scandal around him disappear. If anything, it only grew, because Epstein had been extraordinarily well connected. He had mixed with presidents and prime ministers, billionaires and celebrities, people from every corner of the powerful world. And among those people was Prince Andrew. Andrew had known Epstein since the late 1990s. Photographs existed of them together. They had spent time in each other's company in ways that, as the scandal around Epstein grew, became increasingly difficult to explain. In November 2019, Andrew sat down for what has since become one of the most catastrophic interviews in the history of British television, a conversation with journalist Emily Maitlis on the BBC program Newsnight. He went into that interview believing he could set the record straight. He came out of it having made things immeasurably worse. His explanations, including the now infamous claim that he could not have been where a key accuser said he was because he had been at a Pizza Express in Woking, were met with disbelief, ridicule, and a kind of public fury that the palace had not anticipated. Within days, Andrew stepped back from royal duties. He was, for all practical purposes, pushed out of public life. But stepping back from duties was not the same as facing consequences. Andrew continued to live at the Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion on the grounds near Windsor Castle that he had occupied for more than 2 decades. He continued to use his title. He continued to exist in the strange, suspended space of a disgraced royal, still connected to the institution, still drawing on its resources, still sheltered by the deference and legal protection that royalty provides, while the institution itself tried to look the other way and hope the storm would pass. It did not pass, because Virginia Giuffre had not gone away. Giuffre was one of the women who had alleged that she was trafficked by Epstein and that she had been forced to have sexual encounters with Andrew when she was a teenager. Andrew denied this. He denied it repeatedly, categorically, and with the kind of certainty that he seemed to believe would eventually be enough to make the allegation go away. In February 2022, he reached a civil settlement with Giuffre, the terms of which were confidential, but which Andrew's own legal team acknowledged did not include any admission of wrongdoing. In the court of public opinion, however, paying a settlement in a civil case involving such allegations was not easily forgotten. It was not easily separated from the question of guilt in the minds of millions of people watching from a distance. And then, in 2025, Virginia Giuffre died. She passed away in April of that year, leaving behind a world in which she had spent years fighting for accountability, for herself, for other survivors, and for the broader recognition that powerful men who abuse vulnerable young women should not be able to simply walk away untouched. In the months after her death, a memoir she had written was released, detailing the abuse she had allegedly endured at the hands of Epstein and others in his orbit. The book brought everything back into the public conversation with renewed force. It reignited the pressure on the palace. It reignited the pressure on Andrew, and it placed the entire institution of the British monarchy in an uncomfortable spotlight once again. Inside Parliament, voices grew louder. MPs from across the political spectrum began calling for something more drastic, not just a quiet removal from duties, not just a step back from public life, but a formal legal reckoning with what Andrew's continued presence in the royal structure meant. Questions were asked about why he was still living in a 30-room mansion on royal grounds, funded in ways that the public had never been given a full accounting of. Questions were asked about why a man who had settled a civil case connected to sexual abuse allegations was still holding a royal title, still, in the eyes of the law and the state, a prince of the realm. King Charles heard all of this. He had been hearing it for years, managing a problem that had been handed to him by history and by the circumstances of his family. But 2025 was different. Charles was not a new king anymore. He was a king who had navigated the early turbulence of his reign, who had watched his wife Catherine face cancer with extraordinary courage, who had faced his own cancer diagnosis and continued to work through it, who had made clear from the very beginning of his reign that he intended to shape the monarchy for the future, to make it leaner, more focused, more capable of surviving in a world that had very little patience for the old assumptions of royal privilege. And in that context, Andrew had become something the institution simply could not continue to carry. On September 16, 2025, Charles and Andrew were seen together at the funeral of the Duchess of Kent at Westminster Cathedral. They walked out of the building side by side, brothers, family, 2 men connected by blood and history. It was one of the last times they would appear together in any public setting that could be described as normal, because behind the scenes, something was already in motion. Charles had been consulting with advisors, with government officials, with the people whose job it was to manage the legal and constitutional mechanisms of the monarchy. He had made his decision. He was waiting only for the right moment to act. That moment came 6 weeks later. On October 30, 2025, Buckingham Palace issued its statement. The formal process had begun. Andrew would lose every title, every honor, the Dukedom of York removed from the peerage roll, the style of Royal Highness gone. The title of Prince taken back, not by an act of Parliament, which would have required a far more complicated constitutional process, but by letters patent issued under the royal prerogative. Charles had found a mechanism that allowed him to act without waiting for Parliament, using the ancient power of the monarchy to manage its own house. The letters patent were published on November 3, 2025 in the official public record known as the Gazette. The entry was brief. It stated with the cold precision of legal language that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor would no longer be entitled to hold and enjoy the style, title, or attribute of Royal Highness, or the titular dignity of Prince. Andrew was also told to leave the Royal Lodge. A formal notice was served to surrender the lease on the property where he had lived for more than 2 decades. He would be moved to alternative private accommodation. The palace was clear that these were censures, the word they used, deemed necessary, even though Andrew continued to deny all the allegations against him. The institution was not waiting for a court verdict. It was not waiting for an admission of guilt. It was acting because the institution itself required it. Because the monarchy, as Charles understood it, had to be protected from the damage that Andrew's continued presence was inflicting on it. For many people across Britain and around the world, the news landed with a kind of grim satisfaction. Survivors of abuse, campaigners for accountability, ordinary citizens who had watched for years as Andrew appeared to float above the consequences that would have destroyed anyone without a royal title, they felt, in this moment, something. Not justice exactly, not the full accounting that many believed was still owed, but something. A line crossed, a reckoning, however partial, however late. Virginia Giuffer's brother, in an interview after the announcement, said that it was a huge moment. That his sister had been fighting for this for a long time, that she had always said only one of them was telling the truth. And now, watching the institution that had sheltered Andrew for so long finally move against him, he said they were proud of her. They wished she was here to see it. But the story was not over, because even as the titles fell away, one thing did not change. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, disgraced and detitled and evicted from his mansion, remained in the line of succession to the British throne. He was still, legally and constitutionally, 8th in line to become King of England. And that fact, that stubborn, uncomfortable, legally tangled fact, was about to become the next chapter of a drama that showed no signs of being finished. There is a particular kind of absurdity that only institutions as old as the British monarchy can produce. The absurdity of a man who has lost everything that made him royal, yet who still sits, by law and by ancient inheritance, inside the line of those who could one day wear the crown. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was no longer a prince. He no longer held any title recognized by the state. He had been removed from his home. He had been publicly censured by his own brother, the king. And yet, when legal experts and constitutional scholars sat down in the days and weeks after October 30, 2025, and looked at the actual structure of British succession law, they all arrived at the same answer. He was still 8th in line to the throne. Nothing that had happened, not the letters patent, not the surrender of the lease at Royal Lodge, not the withdrawal of his Royal Highness styling, had moved him a single place in the queue. He remained exactly where birth had put him, behind William, George, Charlotte, Louis, Harry, Archie, and Lilibet, but ahead of every other member of the extended royal family. This was not a detail. This was a fact that sat at the very center of a constitutional crisis that was now fully visible to the public for the first time. Because the question was no longer just about Andrew. The question was about the rules themselves, about whether a modern democracy with a constitutional monarchy could continue to operate under laws that meant a disgraced, detitled man with a settled civil case involving sexual abuse allegations could still, in theory, become King of England. The answer, as the law stood, was yes, and that answer was proving impossible for a growing number of people to accept. The distinction between losing a title and losing a place in the succession was not one that most people outside legal and constitutional circles understood intuitively. In everyday language, if you strip someone of everything that makes them a prince, the natural assumption is that they are no longer in line to be king. That is the logical conclusion that most people would draw. But constitutional law is not always built on logical conclusions. It is built on statute, on precedent, on the layered and often contradictory accumulation of centuries of legislation. And the law governing succession to the British throne was clear. Only an act of Parliament could remove someone from the line. The king could use his royal prerogative to manage titles and honors. He could not use it to move someone out of succession. Those were two entirely separate mechanisms, operating in two entirely separate legal universes. The last time Parliament had removed someone from succession through legislation was in 1701, with the Act of Settlement, which excluded Catholics from the line and established the Protestant succession that still governs the British monarchy today. Modifying the succession has always been a constitutional event of the highest order, not something done lightly, not something done quickly, and not something that affects only Britain. Because of the Statute of Westminster, passed in 1931, any change to the laws of succession that affect the British Crown would also require the agreement of every Commonwealth realm where the British monarch serves as head of state. That includes Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a dozen other nations. A change to succession law in the United Kingdom is not simply a British matter. It is a matter that touches the constitutional arrangements of 15 countries. The process of achieving consensus across all of them is slow, complicated, and politically sensitive in ways that go far beyond any single royal family drama. This is why, when members of Parliament began calling for Andrew to be formally removed from the succession following the October 2025 announcement, the government's response was careful. On February 23, 2026, the government stated publicly that it was not ruling out action on Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's place in the line of succession. The phrase "not ruling out" is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of political language available to a government that wants to appear responsive without actually committing to anything. It means, we hear you. It means we are aware of the pressure. It means we are not going to tell you we will never do this. But it does not mean we will do this or when or how. As of the middle of 2026, no legislation had been passed. Andrew remained legally eighth in line. The debate this created was not a quiet one. In newspaper columns, on radio programs, in parliamentary debates, and on social media, the question of what it meant for a man in Andrew's position to remain in succession was argued passionately from multiple directions. There were those who said it was simply an embarrassment, that the optics of the situation were terrible, that the image of a disgraced man technically eligible to become king was corrosive to public confidence in the institution, and that Parliament should act as quickly as the constitutional constraints would allow. There were others who took a more cautious view, not defending Andrew, but warning that the precedent of removing a named individual from the succession through a targeted act of Parliament was itself potentially dangerous. If Parliament could do it to Andrew, the reasoning went, then Parliament could do it to anyone. The line between a constitutional adjustment and a political purge was not always as clear as it seemed in the heat of the moment. British royals expert Hilary Fordwich put it directly, describing Andrew's continued place in the succession as embarrassing at best, while also noting that, given his position so far down the line, behind the Sussex children, behind all of William's heirs, there was little realistic risk of him ever becoming king. The practical danger was minimal. The symbolic damage was considerable, and for an institution whose power rests largely on symbolism, on the idea that the crown represents something stable, something honorable, something above the ordinary transactional mess of politics, symbolic damage is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the only thing that really matters. Meanwhile, inside the family, the story was continuing to develop in ways that went beyond the legal and constitutional dimensions. Andrew had not simply accepted his situation and disappeared quietly. Reports emerged in the weeks and months after the October announcement that he was pushing back on the requirement to leave Royal Lodge, that his legal team was exploring what protections his lease gave him, what rights he might have as a tenant, what mechanisms existed to slow or complicate the process of his eviction from the home where he had lived for more than 20 years. It was a strange kind of rearguard action, a man who had just been publicly stripped of his royal identity, fighting for the right to stay in a royal house. But it was consistent with everything that had come before. Andrew had always believed, or at least behaved as if he believed, that the protections and privileges of his birth would ultimately see him through. The contrast with how other members of the royal family had navigated difficult periods was striking. When Prince Harry and Meghan stepped back from senior royal duties in early 2020, they had done so loudly and publicly, announcing their intention to build an independent life across the Atlantic, eventually settling in California and engaging in a sustained and often contentious public dialogue about their treatment within the family. The relationship between Harry and the rest of the royals had been strained for years, marked by interviews and books and legal actions that played out in the full glare of international media. But Harry had, in his own way, accepted the terms of his departure. He had given up the full trappings of his senior royal role. He had moved his family out of the UK. He remained in the line of succession, fifth, as of 2026, with his children Archie and Lilibet behind him, but he was not fighting to maintain a physical presence in the royal infrastructure of Britain. Andrew's situation was different in character and in kind. He was not choosing to leave. He was being pushed. And whatever he said publicly about accepting the king's decision, the private legal maneuvering told a different story. It told the story of a man who had spent 65 years inside a world that defined him entirely, a world of palaces and titles and deference and protocol, and who could not quite bring himself to fully accept that the door had closed. That the world he had known was gone. That Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, private citizen, was who he now was and who he would remain. For the king, watching all of this, the situation presented its own set of complications. Charles was a man who had waited longer than any heir in British history to take the throne. He was 73 when he was crowned, in May 2023, after decades of preparation for a role that had always felt, to many observers, both his destiny and his burden. He was a man who had thought deeply about the monarchy's future, who had written and spoken and argued for decades about the environment, about architecture, about the relationship between the crown and the Commonwealth, about what the institution needed to become in order to survive in the 21st century. He had come to the throne at a moment of enormous fragility. His mother had died, the nation was grieving. The questions about the monarchy's relevance and sustainability were louder than they had been in a generation. And then, almost immediately, his wife was diagnosed with cancer. And then he was diagnosed with cancer. And then Andrew. The image that the palace worked hardest to project through all of this was one of steadiness, of a king who was managing his health, managing his duties, managing his family, moving forward rather than pulling back, honoring commitments rather than retreating behind palace walls. A senior palace source had described this approach in terms that captured something essential about how Charles understood his role. The monarchy has to keep moving forward. Even when conditions are challenging, even when the ground is shifting, even when the person who is supposed to hold it all together is dealing with a cancer diagnosis while evicting his brother from a mansion and being asked to explain to 15 countries why a disgraced man is still technically in line to be their king. And through all of this, the wider royal family was also changing in ways that went far beyond the Andrew story. Prince William, at 44 years old, was increasingly the face of a monarchy in transition, present, active, deeply engaged in the duties of the heir apparent, a visible and credible symbol of the institution's future in a way that gave those who cared about the crown's survival genuine reasons for optimism. His wife, Catherine, had announced in January 2025 that she was in remission from cancer, and the months that followed had seen her return to public life with a steadiness and grace that seemed to resonate powerfully with a public that had watched her illness with enormous anxiety. Their children, George, 13, Charlotte, 11, Louis, 8, were growing up in the full consciousness of who they were and what they would one day be asked to carry. Prince George, in particular, was approaching the age at which the royal education and the full meaning of his position would begin in earnest. This was the family into which the succession question had dropped like a stone into still water. The ripples were moving outward in every direction. And at the center of those ripples was a man who no longer had a title, who was fighting not to leave his house, whose name had become inseparable from scandal, and who still, by the ancient and apparently inescapable logic of hereditary monarchy, held a technical claim to one of the oldest thrones in the world. The deeper question, the one that haunted the edges of every debate about Andrew's succession status, was not really about Andrew at all. It was about what the monarchy was for, what it meant, what it was supposed to represent in a world that had grown impatient with inherited privilege and unearned position. The argument for removing Andrew from the line was not just that he was embarrassing or that his continued presence was damaging. The argument was that a modern institution which claimed to represent something noble about continuity and service and national identity could not credibly make that claim while keeping a space in its most fundamental structure for a man credibly accused of the things Andrew was accused of. The institution and the individual were in contradiction, and something had to give. But the argument on the other side, the argument for caution, for patience, for working through the proper constitutional channels without rushing, was not made purely from cynicism or from a desire to protect Andrew. It was made from a genuine concern about the stability of a system of governance that depended on its rules meaning something. If those rules could be bent or broken for political convenience, even in service of an outcome that seemed obviously right, then what was the guarantee that they would not be bent again in circumstances less obviously justified? The strength of a constitutional system lies not in its flexibility, but in its predictability. And the predictability of the British succession law, however imperfect and however uncomfortable in the current moment, was something that its defenders argued should not be discarded lightly. So as 2026 moved through its months, the story remained unresolved in its most fundamental dimension. Andrew was gone from public royal life, gone from his title, being moved, however slowly and reluctantly, from his home. But he was not gone from the succession. And the question of whether he ever would be was one that would require an answer not from a king using his prerogative powers, but from parliaments and governments and constitutional conventions across 15 nations. It was a question, in other words, that could not be answered quickly. That could not be answered by one man's decision. And that left the British royal family in an extraordinary position, having made the most dramatic internal move against one of its own members in over a century, and yet finding that the story was still, stubbornly, not finished. Institutions do not change easily. They resist. They delay. They find 100 reasons to do tomorrow what could have been done yesterday, and 100 more reasons to do next year what could have been done today. The British monarchy is, in this respect, the most accomplished institution in the world. It has been resisting change, and then at the last possible moment, changing just enough to survive for over 1,000 years. What happened in late 2025 and into 2026 was, in one sense, exactly this kind of reluctant adjustment. A reckoning that came years too late, pushed forward by forces the palace could no longer contain. But it was also something more. Because the Andrew decision did not exist in isolation. It was part of a larger transformation, slow, sometimes painful, and not yet complete in what the British royal family was and what it was trying to become. To understand the full weight of that transformation, you have to look not just at what was taken away, but at what was being built in its place. King Charles, for all the difficulty of his circumstances, the cancer, the family tensions, the constitutional complications, had a clear idea of what he wanted the monarchy to be. He had articulated it in various forms over many years before he even came to the throne. A smaller, more focused institution. A crown that justified its existence not through the weight of tradition alone, but through active, visible service. A royal family that was defined by its core working members rather than by the sprawling, extended network of relatives who had historically been able to trade on their connection to royalty without bearing any of the responsibilities that connection should have carried. The slimmed-down monarchy, a concept that had been discussed and debated for decades, was not just an idea anymore. Under Charles, it was becoming policy. And the treatment of Andrew was, in the starkest possible terms, its most visible expression. There was a certain bitter irony in the timing. Andrew had always imagined himself as someone who mattered, who contributed, who had a role to play. After his forced removal from public duties in 2019, he had spent years pushing, through intermediaries and through his own persistent lobbying, for a path back. He wanted to return to public life. He believed, or at least behaved as if he believed, that the storm would pass, that the public memory would fade, that some pathway existed between where he was and where he wanted to be. The palace under Charles closed that pathway permanently. There was no comeback planned. There was no rehabilitation being quietly considered. There was only the diminishing footprint of a man whose position had been reduced, step by step, to almost nothing. What made this particularly striking was the contrast with how the family had handled earlier controversies. For years, the instinct of the British monarchy when confronted with scandal had been to wait it out, to issue measured statements, to avoid confrontation, to trust that time and the shortness of public attention would eventually smooth over whatever rough surface had appeared. It had worked more or less across generations of royal difficulty. Divorces, scandals, embarrassing interviews, affairs. The institution had absorbed all of it, bent without breaking, continued on. But the Epstein scandal was different in its nature from anything that had come before. It was not a matter of personal failing or romantic indiscretion, the kind of human messiness that could be forgiven, if not forgotten. It touched something far more serious, the abuse of young girls, the trafficking of vulnerable people by the powerful and the connected, a kind of criminality so fundamental in its violation of human dignity that the usual tools of royal crisis management simply did not apply. Waiting it out was not an option. The public would not allow it. And the evidence, piling up in books and court records and parliamentary debates, kept making waiting more costly with every month that passed. Charles had also been shaped by a different understanding of what the monarchy owed to public credibility than his predecessors. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had guided the crown through 67 years of extraordinary change with a philosophy that could be summarized as, "Do your duty, say very little, and trust that the institution will outlast the moment." It was a philosophy that had worked brilliantly for most of her reign, but it had also, in the final years, begun to show its limits. The handling of Diana's death in 1997, the initial silence from Balmoral, the delay in returning to London, the sense that the palace was managing an inconvenience rather than a national grief, had exposed a gap between what the institution thought it owed the public and what the public actually needed from it. Elizabeth had learned from that. The monarchy had adapted. But Charles had taken a different lesson from all of it. He had concluded that the institution could no longer afford to simply wait and hope. It had to act. It had to be seen to act. And the action, when it came, had to be real, not a press release, not a quiet step back, but a formal, legally documented, publicly announced reckoning. The November 3 letters patent, the document that made Andrew's detitling official and permanent, was that reckoning. Published in the Gazette, the official public record of the British state, it carried the weight of history in every line. It was the kind of document that would be cited in law journals and constitutional histories for generations. Not because Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was particularly important in himself. He was not, and would not be, but because of what the document represented. A monarchy that had decided, through its king, and with the formal machinery of its own legal power, that some things could not be tolerated regardless of blood. That the crown had an obligation to the public it served that outweighed the obligations of family loyalty. That there were limits, finally, to what royalty could protect you from. In the weeks after the announcement, the reaction from survivors and campaigners was nuanced and complicated. There was satisfaction, the kind that comes from watching a powerful institution finally, however belatedly, acknowledge that it cannot simply absorb and neutralize accountability. Virginia Giuffre had died without seeing a criminal verdict against Andrew. She had died with his denials still on the record, and his settlement still carrying the legal disclaimer of no admission of wrongdoing. But she had died having made his life genuinely uncomfortable, having forced a settlement, having sustained a public campaign that kept the pressure on him year after year, having refused to be one of those stories that simply faded when the protagonist wished it to. Her brother, speaking in the weeks after the October announcement, captured what many felt, that this was a vindication, however incomplete, of everything she had fought for. But there was also the recognition that the formal outcome, a man stripped of titles asked to leave his house, his succession status still a matter of constitutional debate, was not the same as justice. Justice would have looked different. Justice would have involved a full and transparent accounting in a court of law, where evidence would have been tested and facts would have been established, and consequences would have flowed directly from those facts. What had happened instead was an institutional adjustment, significant, historic, genuinely meaningful in its own terms, but still a long distance from the kind of accountability that the survivors of Epstein's network had consistently demanded. The British government in February 2026 had said it was not ruling out further action on Andrew's succession status. That phrase, not ruling out, was not justice. It was a door left slightly ajar, and for many people a slightly ajar door was not enough. Inside the palace the focus had shifted. Andrew's situation was in a practical sense handled. The formal mechanisms had been deployed. The legal documents had been signed and published. The lease on Royal Lodge had been served with formal notice. What remained was the slow, sometimes fractious business of the actual transition, the legal disputes over the property, the question of where Andrew would actually live, the management of a private individual who still attracted enormous public interest and who had the means and the motivation to continue making noise if he chose to. These were not trivial concerns, but they were, compared to what had preceded them, operational rather than constitutional. The king had made his decision. The palace had acted on it. The law had been set in motion. The rest was a matter of time. And time, in the story of the British monarchy, is the variable that everything else bends around. The institution has survived because it has been, across centuries, better at waiting than any of the forces that tried to overwhelm it. It has outlasted republics, revolutions, world wars, and the slow erosion of every other hereditary monarchy in the world's most powerful nations. It has done this not through rigidity, but through a particular kind of flexible endurance, the ability to change what needed to change while holding the core of what it was steady enough to be recognizable across generations. What King Charles was attempting, through the Andrew decision and through everything else he was doing, was to update that core. To find the version of the monarchy that could endure in a 21st century world where the old deferences were gone, where power had to be earned rather than inherited, where the institution's survival depended on its ability to make ordinary people believe it deserved to exist. Whether he was succeeding was a question that could not yet be fully answered. The monarchy in 2026 was, by almost any measure, more stable than it had been in 2022 when Charles took the throne, more stable than the turbulent years of the late 1990s and early 2000s, when it had seemed, to some observers, genuinely endangered. The public approval numbers for the crown were not what they had been in the middle of the 20th century, but they were not catastrophic either. William and Catherine, as the next generation, commanded a level of genuine affection and respect that the institution needed. The children, George, Charlotte, Louis, were growing up with the cameras at a careful distance, their lives managed in ways designed to protect them from the worst of the exposure while preparing them for what was coming. The machinery was working, not perfectly, not without friction, but working. The Andrew chapter, for all its ugliness and all the damage it had done, had in a perverse way demonstrated something about the institution that its defenders had always claimed, but had never been able to prove quite so dramatically, that it could hold its own members accountable. That the crown was not simply a shelter for the powerful, a private club where scandal could always be managed and diluted and eventually dissolved. That when the pressure was great enough and the case was clear enough, the institution could look at one of its own, a brother of the king, a son of Queen Elizabeth, someone who had been a prince since the day he was born, and say, "No, not anymore. You have done what you have done, and we cannot carry you any further. This is where we part." That had not been easy. It had taken years longer than many believed it should have. It had come too late to give Virginia Giuffre the satisfaction of seeing it while she was alive. It had come in a form, a stripping of titles, a loss of housing, that left the succession question unresolved and the legal accountability question entirely unanswered. It was not, by any honest measure, the full reckoning that the moment seemed to demand, but it was real, and it was permanent. And for an institution built on the idea that some things, once granted, cannot be taken back, the fact that they had been taken back, the fact that the letters patent existed, that the Gazette had published the entry, that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was now a legal fact rather than a scandalous rumor, meant something that would not quickly be undone. The line of succession, as it stood in July 2026, began with William and moved through his children and then down to Harry and his children and then to Andrew, the 8th name on a list of 25. Whether that 8th name would still be there in a year or 5 years or 10, whether Parliament would eventually pass the legislation required to move it, remained genuinely uncertain. The government had not ruled it out. It had not ruled it in. It had not given a timeline or a commitment. The constitutional machinery moved slowly, as constitutional machinery always does, and the political will to push it through, against the complexity of Commonwealth agreement, against the concerns about precedent, against the inertia that large institutions always generate when they are asked to change their most fundamental rules, was still being assembled. But the larger story, the story of a monarchy trying to define itself for a new era, trying to hold together the contradictions of ancient inheritance and modern accountability, trying to be the thing that 67 million people in Britain and hundreds of millions more around the world needed it to be. That story was very much alive. It was alive in the image of Catherine at Wimbledon in the summer of 2026, returned to public duties, elegant and composed, the future of the institution made visible. It was alive in the image of George, 13 years old, aware of who he was in ways that were just beginning to reveal their full weight. It was alive in the continuing work of a king who was unwell, but unbowed, moving through his schedule of engagements with the determination of someone who understood, at a level deeper than politics or strategy, that what he was doing mattered, not just for him, not just for his family, but for something larger and older and more complicated than any individual story could contain. and it was alive in the absence of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, no longer a prince, no longer a duke, no longer a resident of the royal estate that had been his home for a quarter century. A man who had once stood among the most protected and most privileged people in the world, and who had, through the accumulation of his own choices and the eventual exhaustion of the institution's patience, lost almost all of it. The crown had changed everything for him. And in doing so, it had changed something about itself that would not easily be reversed. The monarchy had drawn a line. It had said, in the language of law and of letters patent and of formal public record, that there were things it would not protect. There were things it would not cover. There were things it could not, in the end, afford to keep. That line was now part of the record, part of the history, part of whatever the British royal family would say it was when someone asked, generations from now, what happened in the autumn of 2025, when a king stripped a brother of his name, and the world watched, and the institution looked for a moment, not like a relic of an older world, but like something that was genuinely trying to earn its place in this one.